The training ring on Meridian Station smelled like scorched metal and cold sweat, and Instructor Vorn was already 3 steps into my personal space before I finished my sentence. "With respect, sir, the simulation parameters are wrong," I said. "You set the gravity plating for a Drenai skeletal frame. Human bones don't bend that way. Nobody's going to clear that obstacle without snapping something." 20 cadets stood in a loose circle around us, and I could feel every one of their eyes on me. Daniel Pierce, to my left, had gone very still, the way he always did right before something bad happened. Ellie Marsh wasn't even breathing. I didn't blame them. Talking back to Instructor Vorn wasn't just against the rules. It was something nobody had done in the 4 months since our class arrived at the academy. Vorn tilted his head. Behind the reflective faceplate of his mask, I could see the vague shape of his features, but not his expression. That was the point of the mask. Drenai officers wore them during instruction so cadets couldn't read anger, or amusement, or anything at all. It made every lesson feel like being tested by a machine that had once been alive. "You question my calibration," he said. His voice came out flat through the mask's speaker, stripped of all the emotion a human voice would carry. "I'm not questioning your intent, sir. I'm questioning the numbers. Owen already dislocated his shoulder last week on a course set the same way. If we run this again, someone's going to get hurt worse than a dislocation." Cadet Whitfield, he said my name like it was something distasteful in his mouth. "You are a first-cycle recruit from a species that did not exist to this coalition 3 years ago. You do not correct my calibration. I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to keep my squad from getting broken bones over bad math." I heard Daniel exhale beside me, a long, slow breath, like he was trying to physically hold the moment together. I understood why. In the 4 months since Earth had joined the coalition, we had all learned the same lesson over and over. Humans were the newest species in this alliance, the least understood, and by most accounts, the least respected. Every alien species here had thousands of years of shared history with each other. We had shown up a few decades ago waving radio signals and asking to be let in. Some species thought that was charming. The Drenai were not among them. Vorn took another step forward. The rest of the cadets shifted back, all of them, except me. I don't know why I didn't move. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was because I had grown up watching my older brother get talked over by people who assumed his quiet nature meant he had nothing to say, and something in me refused to do that to myself, even in front of an armored alien officer twice my size. "You will run the course as configured," Vorn said. "All of you. Sir, at least let me adjust the plating for the human squad. It'll take 10 minutes. I didn't get to finish. His hand moved faster than I expected, faster than anything his size should have been able to move, and the back of his gloved hand caught me across the cheek and jaw. The sound of it cracked through the ring louder than it should have, bouncing off the metal walls, and for a second the whole world tilted sideways with the force of it. I don't remember deciding to react. There wasn't a decision. There was the sting spreading across my face, the ringing in my ear, and then there was my own arm already moving, faster than thought, faster than the training exercises we had run 100 times. My elbow came up and around in the same motion my father had drilled into me on our back porch when I was 12 years old, learning to defend myself against boys twice my size at school who thought being bigger meant being right. My elbow connected with the side of Vorn's mask. The sound that came out of it wasn't like the sound of hitting armor. It was sharper, a crack, high and thin, like ice breaking on a pond. A spiderweb of fractures bloomed across the left side of his faceplate, right where the reinforced plating was supposed to be strongest. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the low hum of the station's ventilation seemed to fall silent, though I knew that couldn't be true. My ears were still ringing from the strike I had taken, and my elbow throbbed where it had made contact, but none of that mattered next to what I was looking at. Instructor Vorn was frozen in place, his hand still half raised from where he had struck me, and through the crack in his mask, I could see one wide, pale eye staring at me with an expression that had nothing to do with the calm, flat voice he always used. It looked, for just a moment, like fear. Daniel was the first to speak, and even he barely managed a whisper, "Maya." I didn't answer him. I couldn't stop looking at that crack in the mask. In 4 months at this academy, I had heard endless lectures about how fragile humans were compared to every other species in the coalition. How our bones broke easier, how our reflexes were slower, how we were, as one visiting diplomat had put it during an orientation lecture, charmingly primitive. Vorn's mask was rated to withstand blows from Kolvek's soldiers, whose exoskeletons could crush Duracrete. It was not supposed to crack from a human elbow. And yet there it was, a spider web of fractures catching the harsh light of the training ring, and Vorn hadn't even had time to blink. The silence broke when the ring's overhead alarm system activated, a low whooping tone that meant a physical altercation had been detected between a cadet and a superior officer. Red light washed over the training floor. Somewhere above us, a door hissed open, and I heard the heavy footfalls of station security approaching at a run. Vorn lowered his hand slowly. He reached up with his other hand and touched the crack in his mask, almost like he didn't believe it was real either. Then his hand fell away, and his voice came through the speaker again, quieter now, stripped of the authority it usually carried. "You struck a superior officer." "You struck me first," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, though my whole body was shaking. "In front of 19 witnesses. That is not the point." His voice had an edge to it now, something I hadn't heard from him before. Not just anger, something closer to alarm. "Do you understand what you have done?" I didn't. Not really. Not yet. All I understood in that moment was the sting on my cheek, the ache in my elbow, and the sight of that crack spreading slowly across his mask like a small, silent explosion. Security arrived a moment later, 4 coalition officers in dark uniforms, none of them human. They fanned out around the ring, and their leader, a broad-shouldered, sallow officer with mottled blue-gray skin, looked between me and Vorn with an expression I couldn't read at all. "Instructor Vorn," the sallow officer said, "report." "The cadet struck me," Vorn said. "After he struck her," Daniel said, stepping forward before I could stop him. His voice shook, but he kept going. "We all saw it. He hit her across the face first." The sallow officer's gaze moved to me, then to the crack in Vorn's mask, and lingered there for a long moment. I saw something shift in his expression, something careful and calculating, like he was recalculating a number he had assumed was fixed. "Cadet," he said to me, "come with us." I looked around the ring one last time before they led me away. Ellie was crying quietly. Owen looked like he'd seen a ghost, and Vorn stood exactly where he had been standing, one hand still resting near the crack in his mask, watching me go with that single visible eye, wide and unreadable, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had just changed all its rules. I didn't know it yet, but I had just become the most talked-about person on Meridian Station, and the conversation was only beginning. They walked me down 3 levels to a holding area near the security wing, past viewports that looked out on the slow turn of the station against the black of space. Nobody spoke to me on the way. I kept flexing my fingers, testing the ache in my elbow, half expecting it to feel different somehow, like it should hurt more for what it had done. It didn't. It just felt like an elbow that had hit something hard. The holding room was small, gray, and empty except for a bench and a narrow window that looked out onto a corridor. I sat down and pressed my palm against my cheek where Vorn had struck me. It was already swelling, tender under my fingers, and I knew by morning it would bruise dark and ugly. That thought made something twist in my chest that had nothing to do with the pain. I hadn't cried when he hit me. I wasn't going to start now. A voice crackled through a speaker in the ceiling. "Cadet Whitfield, remain seated. You will be addressed shortly." I sat, and I waited, and I thought about my brother, about the back porch, about my father's voice telling me that being underestimated wasn't a weakness if you knew how to use it. I hadn't understood what he meant back then. I was starting to understand it now. In a holding cell on a space station 300 light-years from home, with a bruise blooming on my face and the memory of a cracked alien mask burned into my mind. Whatever came next, I told myself, I was not going to apologize for defending myself. Not to Vorn, not to anyone. The door hissed open 40 minutes later, and Commander Alice Fenwick walked in. Commander Fenwick was the ranking human officer on Meridian Station, one of only 3 humans who held any real authority in the Coalition's command structure. She was in her 40s, with short gray streaked hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from spending years defending a species nobody quite trusted yet. She closed the door behind her and stood there for a moment, just looking at me. "Turn your face toward the light," she said. I did. She studied the bruise on my cheek without saying anything, her jaw tightening slightly. "That's going to need a cold compress," she said finally. "Sit still." "Ma'am, I want to explain what happened. I already know what happened." 4 cadets gave statements before I even got down here. Daniel Pierce practically climbed over a security officer to make sure someone heard him. She pulled a small medical kit from her jacket and pressed a cooling patch gently against my cheek. "You struck a Draenei training instructor. Do you understand how rare that is? He hit me first. I know. I'm not questioning that. I'm telling you that in 3 years of Coalition membership, no human has ever landed a blow on a Draenei officer that did any damage. Not one. Their masks are rated for impacts from species 3 times our density." She paused, studying me carefully. "You cracked his faceplate, Maya. Not dented it, cracked it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Do you know why he wears that mask during instruction?" she asked. "I always thought it was tradition, so students can't read his reactions." "Partly. It's also because Draenei officers are taught from childhood that showing emotion during a display of authority is a weakness. The mask hides everything. Fear, anger, doubt." She sat down on the bench across from me, "which means when you cracked it, every cadet in that ring saw something no Draenei officer is supposed to let anyone see. His eye, his fear. That's not just physical damage, Maya. That's a wound to everything he's built his career on." "I didn't plan it, it just happened." "That's exactly the problem," she said, "and exactly why this is going to be complicated." She explained what came next, while the cooling patch did its slow work on my cheek. Under Coalition military law, striking a superior officer was treated with extreme severity, regardless of species, because so many Alliance members came from cultures where hierarchy was sacred. Some species considered it grounds for permanent expulsion from any military structure. A few considered it grounds for far worse. But the law also recognized self-defense, and it recognized that an instructor who struck a cadet first had broken a rule that existed specifically to prevent this kind of escalation. "There will be a formal hearing," she said, "probably within the week. It won't just be a human matter. The Coalition Oversight Board will want representatives present because this involves a Draenei officer and a human cadet, and frankly, because word is already spreading faster than I'd like." "Spreading how?" "There were sensors recording that entire training session, Maya. Every academy ring has them for safety review. Someone on the security detail already leaked a clip to a Coalition news feed. By tomorrow, half this station is going to have seen you crack that mask." I felt my stomach drop. That's not going to help anything. "No," Fenwick agreed. "But it's not going to hurt as much as you think either. There are a lot of people in this coalition who have been waiting a long time to see a Draenei officer humbled. You just gave them a reason to pay attention to humans in a way 4 months of polite diplomacy never did." I sat with that for a while, turning it over. I thought about Vorn's single visible eye through the crack in his mask, wide and afraid, and I thought about every lecture I had sat through since arriving at the academy, every subtle comment about how humans lack the reflexes, the density, the discipline of older Coalition species. I thought about the word primitive, and how many times I had heard it used about my own species like it was simply a fact, not an insult. "What happens to me if the hearing doesn't go well?" I asked. Fenwick's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Depending on how the oversight board frames the charge, the range runs from disciplinary reassignment all the way up to expulsion from the coalition military program entirely. In rare cases, physical harm to a superior officer during training has been treated as a criminal matter under joint coalition law. Criminal? I'm not saying that's likely, I'm saying it's possible, and I want you prepared for every version of what's coming, not just the comfortable one. She reached out and adjusted the cooling patch slightly. You're not the only one on trial here, Maya, even if your name is the only one on the paperwork. Every human on this station is going to be judged by how this plays out. That's not fair, but it's true. I nodded slowly, though the weight of it settled into my chest like a stone. Fenwick studied me a moment longer, then softened, just slightly, the way she rarely did in front of other officers. For what it's worth, she said, I watched that footage twice already. You didn't swing wild. You didn't panic. You reacted the way you were trained to react when someone attacks you, clean and fast, and you stopped the moment the threat stopped. That's not the behavior of someone who lost control. That's the behavior of someone whose body knew exactly what to do before her mind caught up. My dad taught me, I said quietly, before I ever thought I'd need it for anything like this. Then your dad taught you well. She stood, gathering the medical kit. Get some rest. You're confined to quarters until the hearing is scheduled, which means no training, no mess hall, and definitely no contact with Instructor Vorn or his squad. I'll have food brought to you. Commander, I said, before she reached the door. Is he going to be all right, Vorn? She paused, her hand on the door panel, and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. That's an interesting question for you to be asking right now. I didn't try to hurt him like that. I just reacted. I know. She considered me for a moment longer. Physically, he'll be fine. The mask absorbed most of the impact, which is what it's designed to do, even cracked. But I don't think you understand yet what you actually broke in that room, Maya. It wasn't just a piece of armor. She left without explaining further, and the door sealed shut behind her with a soft hydraulic hiss, leaving me alone in the small gray room with my thoughts and the slow ache spreading through my elbow. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the crack spreading across Vorn's mask again, heard that thin, sharp sound, saw the single wide eye staring at me through the fracture. I kept turning the moment over, trying to understand it from every angle, the way you probe a bruise to see how much it hurts. It hadn't felt powerful in the moment. It had felt instinctive, almost involuntary, my body moving before my mind gave permission. But lying in the narrow bunk of my quarters, staring at the ceiling, I started to understand what Fenwick meant. It wasn't just that I had hurt him. It was that I had proven something wrong, something the entire coalition, and maybe Vorn most of all, had believed without question since the day humanity first made contact. We were supposed to be slow, fragile, behind, and for 1/2 second in a training ring, none of that had been true. Morning came, if you could call it that on a station where the lighting cycled on a fixed schedule, regardless of any actual sun. I woke to the soft chime of my door unlocking and Daniel's voice through the intercom, quiet and urgent. Maya, you awake? Yeah. I sat up, wincing at the stiffness in my shoulder. Fenwick said no visitors. I'm not visiting. I'm delivering rations. Completely different thing. The door slid open, and Daniel stepped in carrying a tray, his expression a strange mixture of worry and something that looked almost like awe. He set the tray down and looked at my face, at the bruise that had darkened overnight into a deep, ugly purple along my cheekbone. That looks bad, he said. Feels worse. Maya, the whole academy is talking about you. I mean the whole academy. Cadets from 3 other species stopped me in the corridor this morning, asking if it was true you cracked a Draenei officer's mask with your bare arm. It wasn't my bare arm. It was my elbow. There's a difference. That's not the point. He sat down across from me, lowering his voice even though we were alone. There's a rumor going around that the Coalition Oversight Board already has 3 different species requesting observer status at your hearing. The Colvex delegation is apparently very interested. So is the Sallow Trade Council. Why would trade officials care about a training accident? Because it's not really about the training accident anymore, Maya. It's about what it means. He leaned forward. You know the Drene have been pushing for years to get stricter oversight roles in the Coalition military, based on the idea that other species, especially humans, need more supervision because we're not disciplined enough, not strong enough, not fast enough to be trusted with real responsibility. Half the reason instructors like Vorn treat us the way they do is because it reinforces that argument every single day. I stared at him. You think this changes that argument? I think it puts a crack in it, Daniel said, and something in his voice made it clear he knew exactly what kind of joke he was making, and didn't smile at it anyway. Whatever happens at that hearing, Maya, a lot of people are going to be watching, not just for you, for what happens to the whole idea that humans are the weak link in this alliance. I thought about that for a long time after he left, staring at the tray of food I barely touched, feeling the bruise throb in time with my pulse. I had not asked for any of this. I had wanted to fix a training simulation so my squad mates wouldn't get hurt. I had not wanted to become a symbol, a test case, a crack in an argument that stretched across star systems and species I barely understood. But it seemed the Coalition, and maybe the entire galaxy, had already decided otherwise. 2 days later, the summons arrived. My hearing was scheduled for the following morning, before a full Coalition oversight panel, with observers from 4 member species requesting seats in the gallery. Instructor Vorn would be present. So would the recording from the training ring, which by now had apparently been viewed more times across Coalition news networks than any single piece of footage since first contact with Earth. I read the summons twice, then set it down and looked out the narrow window of my quarters at the slow-turning stars beyond the station's hull. Whatever I had started in that training ring, there was no way to stop it now. All I could do was walk into that hearing tomorrow and try to make sure it ended somewhere worth the cost. The hearing chamber was larger than I expected, a circular room built into the administrative ring of the station, with tiered seating rising on all sides like an amphitheater. I had imagined something clinical and small, a few officers behind a table. Instead, I walked in to find nearly 200 seats filled with observers from species I recognized and several I didn't, all of them turning to look at me as Commander Fenwick led me to a seat near the center of the floor. Daniel had told me the truth. This was not going to be treated as a minor training incident. At the front of the chamber sat the oversight panel, 5 members representing 5 different Coalition species, seated behind a long curved desk of dark metal. In the center sat a Coalition magistrate I didn't recognize, an old, weathered-looking being from a species with pale gray skin and deep-set eyes, wrapped in ceremonial robes that marked high judicial rank. To either side sat representatives from the Sallow, the Colvex, and 2 species I only knew from orientation briefings, the Ithan and the Doru. Instructor Vorn sat across the chamber from me, at a separate table with a Drenai legal advocate beside him. He was not wearing his mask. I hadn't expected that. Without it, his face was narrow and pale, with sharp cheekbones and eyes a shade of amber I hadn't seen through the crack in the training ring. He looked younger than I expected, and more uncertain, though he held himself rigidly upright, the posture of someone determined not to show weakness even now. The magistrate called the session to order, and the low murmur of the gallery fell silent. This hearing concerns an incident of physical conflict between Instructor Vorn Kessick of the Drenai Training Corps and Cadet Maya Whitfield of the Human Delegation, occurring during a scheduled training exercise 4 days ago, the magistrate said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. Sensor recordings from the training ring have been reviewed by this panel and will be presented as evidence. Both parties have submitted statements. We will begin with testimony. The Sallow security officer who had first responded to the incident was called first. He recounted, in careful, measured language, what he had observed upon arrival. A cracked training mask, a visibly injured cadet, and multiple witness statements indicating the instructor had struck first. When asked directly whether he believed the cadet's response constituted excessive force, he paused for a long moment before answering. The response was immediate and proportional to the threat, as perceived in the moment, he said. Whether it was excessive in outcome is a separate question from whether it was excessive in intent. The Draenei advocate seized on that distinction immediately, standing to address the panel. The outcome, however, is precisely what concerns us. A cadet inflicted structural damage on Coalition standard officer equipment rated to withstand strikes from species of significantly greater physical density than the human form. This suggests either a defect in the equipment or a capability in the human cadet that was not disclosed, tested, or accounted for during her admission to this academy. I felt my stomach tighten. This was the argument Daniel had warned me about, twisted into something almost accusatory, as if the fact that I had hurt Vorn was itself the crime, separate from whether he had struck me first. The magistrate raised a hand. The panel will examine both the conduct and the capability questions in turn. Advocate, your concern is noted. Cadet Whitfield, you will now give your account. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked to the small raised platform at the center of the chamber floor. 200 sets of eyes from 4 different species watched me settle into place, and I made myself breathe slowly before I spoke. I told Instructor Vorn that the training simulation's gravity plating was calibrated for a Draenei skeletal structure, not a human one, I said. I explained that a cadet in my squad had already been injured running the same course the week before, and that continuing without adjustment risked further injury. I wasn't trying to undermine his authority. I was trying to prevent someone from getting hurt. And how did Instructor Vorn respond to this concern? The magistrate asked. He told me I didn't have the standing to question his calibration. I tried again to explain the risk. That's when he struck me across the face. Describe the strike. I hesitated, feeling the old bruise ache faintly under my makeup, though most of the swelling had gone down by now. It was open-handed, but hard enough that my vision blurred for a second and my ears rang. I didn't have time to think. My body just reacted. And your reaction was? An elbow strike. Self-defense technique. I learned it from my father when I was a child, long before I ever imagined I'd need it against someone in a position of authority over me. I paused. I want to be clear that I didn't intend to damage his mask specifically. I reacted the way my training told me to react when someone attacks me without warning. The Ethane panel member, a slender figure with iridescent skin that shifted colors slightly as she spoke, leaned forward. Cadet Whitfield, are you aware that Coalition military doctrine explicitly grants instructors limited physical correction authority during high-stakes training scenarios, provided such correction does not exceed reasonable force? I've read the doctrine, yes. Do you believe a single open-handed strike to the face falls within that reasonable threshold? I considered my answer carefully. This was the question that mattered most, I realized. Not whether I had hurt Vorn, whether he had been within his rights to hurt me first. I think the doctrine assumes physical correction is meant to redirect dangerous behavior during an active exercise, like pulling a cadet back from a genuine hazard, I said. I wasn't engaged in dangerous behavior. I was standing still, talking, raising a safety concern about equipment calibration. There was no active hazard for him to correct me out of. There was only a disagreement, and he chose to answer it with force instead of words. A murmur ran through the gallery. The Athenian representative studied me for a long moment, her skin shifting through a pattern of soft blues that I didn't know how to interpret, then nodded slowly and sat back. The magistrate turned to Vorn. Instructor Kessick, your response. Vorn rose from his seat, and for the first time since I had entered the chamber, I saw his hands were trembling slightly at his sides. He walked to the platform, and up close, without the mask, he looked almost fragile, which struck me as strange given everything that had happened. The cadet's account of events is largely accurate, he said, and I felt the entire chamber shift with surprise at the admission. I did strike her. I have served as a training instructor for the Drenai Corps for 11 cycles, across 4 coalition academies, training members of 9 different species. In 11 cycles, no cadet has ever questioned my calibration in front of their squad and continued to press the point after being told to stop. Is that a justification for striking her? The magistrate asked, her tone carefully neutral. Vorn was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. It is an explanation, not a justification. I reacted the way I was trained to react by my own instructors, decades ago, when a subordinate challenged authority in front of others. I believed, incorrectly, that a human cadet would respond the way every other species I had trained responded to that kind of correction. With submission, with silence. And instead, Vorn's amber eyes flicked toward me, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that looked almost like the fear I had seen through the crack in his mask, 4 days and a lifetime ago. Instead, she responded in half a second, with precision, with a strike that fractured equipment rated to withstand forces I did not believe a human body could generate. I have reviewed the sensor data 11 times since the incident. I still do not fully understand what I witnessed. The Colvex panel member, a broad chitinous figure who had said nothing until this point, clicked his mandibles together in a sound I had learned during orientation was the Colvex equivalent of clearing one's throat. Instructor Kessick, are you suggesting the human cadet's physical response exceeded known human capability thresholds? I am suggesting, Vorn said slowly, that our known thresholds for human capability may have been calculated based on incomplete data. I struck the cadet believing my action carried no meaningful risk of retaliation capable of harming me. I was wrong. I would like the panel to understand that this was not a minor miscalculation on my part. It was a fundamental one, and I believe it reflects an assumption held broadly across multiple coalition species, not merely by myself. The chamber went very quiet. I stood on the platform, watching Vorn, and felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't expected. I had walked into this hearing braced for him to minimize what he'd done, to frame me as dangerously unpredictable, a threat that needed containing. Instead, he was doing something almost the opposite, admitting fault while reframing the entire incident as evidence of a much larger error in how the coalition understood humanity. I didn't know yet whether that would help me or hurt me, but I understood, watching him stand there with his hands still trembling at his sides, that whatever this hearing decided about the two of us individually, it was already deciding something much bigger about every human who would ever walk into a coalition training ring after me. The magistrate allowed a long pause before speaking again. The panel will now review the sensor footage in full, followed by technical testimony regarding the structural rating of the damaged equipment and independent analysis of the cadet's physical response. This hearing will reconvene in 2 hours. As the gallery began to file out for the recess, I stepped down from the platform, my legs finally steady beneath me, and found Commander Fenwick waiting near the chamber's edge. She studied my face carefully. "That went better than I expected," she said quietly. He admitted he hit me first. He admitted it was wrong. He did more than that. Fenwick glanced toward where Vorn was being led out by his advocate, still visibly shaken. He just told a room full of coalition observers that every assumption his species holds about human capability might be broken. Do you understand what that's going to do outside this chamber? I didn't. Not fully, not yet. But I was about to find out. The 2-hour recess stretched into something closer to 4 as technical analysts were called in to examine the damaged mask and cross-reference the sensor data against known human physiology. I spent the time in a small side room with Fenwick, picking at a meal I couldn't taste, listening to fragments of conversation drifting in from the corridor outside, cadets and officers and observers from a dozen species all trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. When the panel reconvened, the chamber was even more crowded than before. Word had clearly spread beyond the observers who had secured seats that morning. I saw faces from the human delegation I recognized, Owen and Ellie among them, squeezed into the back rows alongside cadets and officers from species I had no names for. The magistrate called the session back to order and gestured to a coalition technical analyst, a small, precise-looking being from a species I didn't recognize, who stepped forward with a data slate in hand. The panel's technical review confirms the following, the analyst said. The damaged mask was manufactured to coalition standard specifications, rated to withstand impact forces up to and including strikes from Calvex military personnel at full combat output. Independent structural analysis of the crack pattern indicates the impact force generated by Cadet Whitfield's strike exceeded this rating by approximately 18%. Halderkane. A ripple of low sound moved through the gallery. I felt my pulse quicken. Furthermore, the analyst continued, cross-reference against existing human physiological data on file with the coalition indicates this output falls well outside the range predicted by current models of human musculoskeletal capability under standard conditions. Preliminary analysis suggests the discrepancy may be attributable to what human physiologists term an adrenaline response, a temporary and significant enhancement of physical output triggered by acute stress or threat perception, a phenomenon apparently far more pronounced in human biology than in any other coalition species physiology on record. The Calvex representative leaned forward. Are you suggesting humans possess an emergency physical capability beyond their baseline that the coalition has never accounted for in any prior assessment? That is precisely what the data suggests, yes. I sat very still, absorbing this. It explained something I hadn't been able to explain to myself since the moment it happened, why my elbow had moved with a force that still didn't feel like it belonged to me. It wasn't magic. It wasn't some hidden strength I'd been suppressing. It was fear, pure and immediate, turned into motion faster than thought. The magistrate turned back to the chamber. This panel must now weigh two separate findings. First, that Instructor Kessick initiated physical contact with a cadet under circumstances that did not meet the threshold for reasonable corrective force under coalition doctrine. Second, that the cadet's response, while proportional in intent, produced an outcome significantly exceeding known capability models for her species, raising questions this panel is not equipped to resolve within the scope of a single disciplinary hearing. She paused, looking out over the gathered representatives of half a dozen coalition species, all waiting for her next words. This hearing will not conclude today, she said. Given the broader implications of what has been presented, this panel will require additional testimony, including expert analysis of human physiological capability, before rendering judgment on either party. Cadet Whitfield and Instructor Kessick will both remain under standard restriction pending the reconvened hearing, scheduled in 5 days' time. The gallery erupted into murmured conversation as the magistrate called the session closed. I sat on the platform for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything that had just been said settle over me. 5 more days. 5 more days of being the subject of a coalition-wide argument about what humans were actually capable of, an argument I had started without ever meaning to, standing in a training ring trying to keep my friends from getting hurt. Fenwick found me as the chamber emptied, her expression unreadable. Well, she said, it seems you've given the entire coalition a homework assignment. I didn't want any of this, I said quietly. I know. She placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. But like it or not, Maya, you're the assignment now, and in 5 days, we're going to find out exactly how the galaxy grades it. The 5 days between hearings felt longer than the 4 months I had already spent on Meridian Station. I was still confined to quarters, still barred from training, but Fenwick had quietly arranged for Daniel and Ellie to bring me meals twice a day, which meant they also brought me everything they'd heard drifting through the corridors, and there was a lot of it. They're saying the Ethaean delegation requested a full review of human capability testing across the entire academy, Ellie told me on the second day, perched on the edge of my bunk while Daniel stood watch by the door in case a passing officer decided quarters restriction meant no visitors at all. Not just you, every human cadet. They want new baseline measurements. That sounds like it could go either way, I said. It's already going somewhere, Daniel said. Owen got pulled into a session yesterday with 2 coalition physiologists who wanted to run grip strength and reaction time tests on him. He said they looked genuinely surprised by the numbers. I sat with that for a while after they left, turning it over. Fenwick had told me the panel would need expert testimony on human physiology before they could render judgment, and it seemed that testimony was already reshaping itself into something much larger than my hearing alone. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. A discovery that big didn't stay contained to a single disciplinary case. It rippled outward, and ripples could knock things over that had nothing to do with the original stone. On the 3rd day, Fenwick came to see me herself, and she didn't look like someone bringing good news. "I need to tell you something before it becomes public in the hearing," she said, sitting across from me with a data slate in her hands. "It concerns Instructor Kessick's record." "What about it?" "You're not the first cadet he's struck during training." She turned the slate toward me, though I couldn't read the dense coalition script filling the screen. "There have been 3 prior incidents across his 11 cycles as an instructor, involving cadets from 2 different species. In each case, the incident was resolved quietly, without a formal hearing, because the cadets involved either declined to press the matter or were persuaded that doing so would harm their standing in the program." Handwout. My stomach turned. Persuaded how? "I don't know the specifics of all 3 cases, but I do know the pattern. Vorn isn't a monster, Maya. From what I've been able to piece together, he genuinely believes his methods produce disciplined soldiers, and in some cultural context within the coalition, they might. But he has a documented history of using physical correction on cadets who challenge him, and a documented history of that correction being buried rather than addressed." "Why is this coming out now?" "Because your case is too public to bury," Fenwick said simply. "Too many observers, too much footage, too many species suddenly paying attention. Someone on the oversight board's investigative staff started pulling threads once the technical review began, and they found this. It's going to come out at the reconvened hearing, whether Vorn's advocate wants it to or not." I sat back, feeling something complicated settle into my chest. Part of me had spent the last 5 days almost feeling sorry for Vorn, remembering his trembling hands, his admission that he had been wrong, his strange, halting honesty about what he had witnessed in that training ring. This information didn't erase that, but it reframed it. He hadn't been shaken because striking a cadet was unusual for him. He had been shaken because, for the first time, striking a cadet hadn't worked the way it always had before. "What does this mean for the hearing?" I asked. "It means the panel isn't just deciding whether you acted in reasonable self-defense anymore," Fenwick said. "It means they're deciding whether an instructor with a pattern of using force against cadets should continue holding that position at all, across any species. And it means your case has become the example that finally makes that pattern visible." I thought about the other cadets, the ones from 2 different species who had been struck before me, who had been persuaded that silence was safer than a hearing. I thought about how easily that could have been me too, if Daniel hadn't spoken up immediately, if the footage hadn't been leaked, if the timing had been just slightly different. "I want to speak to them," I said. "The other cadets, if they're willing." Fenwick studied me. "Why?" "Because if this is going to become bigger than my case, I wanted to actually help them too, not just prove a point about human strength and then move on." Something shifted in Fenwick's expression, something that looked almost like pride, though she didn't say so directly. "I'll see what I can arrange. No promises. Some of them may not want to be found." She was able to arrange contact with one of them, a Doru cadet named Cyril, 2 cycles ahead of me in the program, who agreed to a brief, careful conversation mediated through a secure channel rather than in person. Cyril's account, delivered in the clipped, formal cadence common to their species, described an incident nearly identical to mine in shape, a disagreement during a training exercise, a strike delivered as correction, and afterward, quiet pressure from senior Drenai staff suggesting that pursuing a formal complaint would mark Cyril as difficult, unsuited for advancement, someone who couldn't handle discipline. I chose silence, Cyril said, the translation software rendering their voice flat and careful. I do not regret surviving, but I do not believe I chose correctly. If my account can prevent this from happening to another cadet, I am willing to provide it to the panel. I thanked Cyril and sat with the recording for a long time afterward, feeling the shape of the whole situation shift again in my mind. This had never really been just about me, or even just about Vorn. It was about a system that had quietly allowed this pattern to continue, because the cadets it happened to had less power than the instructors who did it, and because until 4 days ago, nobody had ever hit back hard enough to make the system look at itself. On the morning of the reconvened hearing, I walked into the chamber with Cyril's testimony logged into the panel's evidence record. My bruise faded now to a faint yellow-green shadow along my cheekbone, and a steadiness in my chest that hadn't been there 5 days earlier. I no longer felt like I was walking in to defend myself. I felt like I was walking in to finish something. The chamber was even fuller than before, observers packed into every tier of seating, and I caught sight of new faces among them, delegations I hadn't seen at the first hearing, drawn in by whatever version of this story had spread across coalition news networks in the intervening days. Vorn sat at his table without his mask again, and this time, when our eyes met across the chamber, he held my gaze for a long moment before looking away. The magistrate opened the session by summarizing the technical findings from the recess, the confirmed structural failure of the mask, the confirmed physiological data suggesting an adrenaline-driven capability spike unique to human biology under threat conditions, and then moved directly into the matter Fenwick had warned me about. This panel has received evidence of a documented pattern of physical correction by Instructor Kessick against cadets in prior training cycles, including testimony from a cadet of the Doru delegation corroborating this pattern, the magistrate said. This raises the scope of this hearing beyond a single incident. Vorn's advocate rose immediately. The panel is conflating separate matters. Prior incidents, if they occurred, were resolved according to standard practice at the time. They cannot retroactively be applied to judge conduct in the current case. They can, and will, be considered as context, the magistrate replied evenly. A pattern of behavior is relevant to whether a single incident represents an aberration or a continuation of established conduct. I watched Vorn during this exchange. He sat very still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, and something in his posture had changed since the first hearing. The rigid defensiveness was gone. What remained looked, strangely, like relief, as though some part of him had been waiting a long time for someone to finally say this out loud. When he was called to respond, he didn't argue with the characterization. The panel is correct, he said quietly. There have been prior incidents. I did not report them as physical corrections requiring review, because I did not believe, at the time, that they constituted misconduct. I believed I was maintaining discipline according to methods taught to me by my own instructors, methods that have gone unquestioned within Draenei training culture for generations. And now, the magistrate asked. Vorn was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes distant. Now I believe those methods were built on an assumption of permanent physical superiority over the cadets I trained, an assumption I no longer hold, and an assumption I am beginning to understand may never have been entirely true, even before Cadet Whitfield proved it false. I do not know how many cadets across how many cycles absorbed corrections they had no true ability to prevent, simply because they lacked either the physical means or the institutional standing to refuse them. I know now that at least one cadet possessed both and chose to use them, and I believe the coalition owes her more than a hearing about whether she was justified. It owes an accounting of why justification was ever necessary at all. I sat on the platform, watching him, and felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't realized was still clenched tight. I had expected, walking into this second hearing, to have to fight for every inch of vindication. Instead, Vorn had just handed the panel an argument more damning than anything I could have made myself. The magistrate looked out over the gathered representatives, 5 species and a gallery of observers from a dozen more, and let the silence stretch before she spoke again. This panel will retire to consider its judgment, she said. Given the scope of what has been presented, that judgment will address not only the conduct of the two individuals before us, but a recommendation regarding training doctrine across the Coalition Military Academy system. This hearing will reconvene tomorrow morning, at which time a final ruling will be delivered. As the gallery rose and began to file out, murmuring among themselves in half a dozen languages I only partially understood, I remained seated on the platform a moment longer, looking across the chamber to where Vorn sat, still and quiet, his hands finally still on the table in front of him. He looked back at me, and for the first time since the crack had spread across his mask, there was nothing guarded in his expression at all. Tomorrow, I would learn what all of this had actually been worth. Tonight, for the first time in 5 days, I thought I might actually be able to sleep. I did sleep that night, more soundly than I expected, and woke to Ellie's voice on the intercom telling me the chamber doors would open in an hour. I dressed slowly, straightened my uniform, and studied my face in the small mirror bolted above the sink in my quarters. The bruise had faded almost entirely now, just a faint shadow along my cheekbone that most people wouldn't notice unless they knew to look for it. It was strange to think that something so small had set off everything that followed. The chamber, when I arrived, was fuller than either previous session, observers packed shoulder to shoulder in every tier, delegations from species I had never even seen on the station before, drawn by whatever version of this story had traveled fastest through Coalition channels overnight. Fenwick walked beside me to my seat, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of tension she rarely allowed to show. "Whatever they decide," she murmured, low enough that only I could hear, "you did this the right way, Maya. Remember that, no matter what comes next." I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to answer. The magistrate entered with the rest of the panel, and the chamber fell silent almost instantly, the way a held breath falls silent. She took her seat, folded her hands atop the curved desk, and looked out over the gathered representatives with an expression that gave nothing away. "This panel has reached its judgment," she said, "on both the individual conduct in question and the broader matters raised during testimony." She turned first to Vorn. "Instructor Kessick, this panel finds that you initiated physical contact against Cadet Whitfield under circumstances that did not meet the Coalition standard for reasonable corrective force. This panel further finds that this incident was not an isolated lapse, but part of a documented pattern extending across multiple training cycles and at least 2 additional cadets, none of whom received the opportunity for formal review that circumstances have afforded in this case." She paused, letting that land before continuing. "In light of these findings, this panel orders your immediate removal from all instructional duties within the Coalition Military Academy system, effective upon the close of this hearing. This panel further recommends a full review of your service record by Drenai Command to determine whether continued military service in any capacity is appropriate." Vorn received this without visible reaction, his hands folded on the table exactly as they had been the day before, though I saw something in the set of his shoulders that looked almost like acceptance rather than resistance. The magistrate turned to me next, and I made myself sit very still, my hands pressed flat against my knees. "Cadet Whitfield," she said, "this panel finds that your response to Instructor Kessick's strike constituted reasonable self-defense under the circumstances presented, and that no disciplinary action is warranted against you for the physical outcome of that response. This panel further finds that your conduct throughout this process, including your decision to bring forward corroborating testimony on behalf of other affected cadets, reflects credibly on your character and your service record." A quiet murmur moved through the gallery, and I felt something in my chest release all at once, a tension I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. But the magistrate wasn't finished. She looked out over the full chamber, addressing not just Vorn and me but every representative gathered in the tiered seating around us. "This panel also wishes to address the matter raised repeatedly throughout these proceedings, regarding the physiological capabilities of the human species and the assumptions upon which current Coalition training doctrine has been built," she said. Independent technical review has confirmed that human biology possesses a stress response capability significantly exceeding prior coalition estimates, one that was entirely absent from the physiological data used to design training protocols, safety equipment ratings, and disciplinary standards applied to human cadets since Earth's admission to this coalition. She let that settle before continuing. This panel recommends, in the strongest terms, a full and immediate review of all human capability data currently held by Coalition Academy systems, and a corresponding review of training doctrine for all instructors working with human cadets across every academy in Coalition territory. This panel also recommends that the incident record from this case, including all supporting testimony, be made available to any Coalition species currently developing training protocols involving previously unassessed member populations, as a precedent for the risks of proceeding on incomplete data. The chamber erupted into overlapping conversation the moment she finished speaking, dozens of voices in a dozen languages rising at once, and the magistrate allowed it for a long moment before calling the session to a formal close. Fenwick's hand found my shoulder as the gallery began to empty, and I turned to find her looking at me with an expression I had never quite seen on her before, something between pride and disbelief. "You understand what just happened, don't you?" she said quietly. "I think so. That wasn't just a ruling on your case, Maya. That was the Coalition admitting, on the record, in front of representatives from a dozen member species, that they've been building policy on wrong assumptions about an entire species since first contact. Every academy in this alliance is going to have to review how it trains humans starting today." I looked past her, across the emptying chamber, to where Vorn still sat at his table, his advocate speaking to him in low, urgent tones he didn't seem to be fully absorbing. As the chamber cleared further, he rose slowly and, instead of leaving through the far exit with his advocate, crossed the floor toward where I stood with Fenwick. He stopped a respectful distance away, closer than he ever had during the hearings, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Cadet Whitfield," he said finally. "Instructor Kessick," I answered, though I suppose that title no longer applied to him. "I owe you an apology I do not know how to properly deliver," he said. "Not simply for what I did in that training ring, though certainly for that, but for every cadet before you who absorbed the same treatment and lacked the standing, or the ability, to answer it the way you did. I built 11 cycles of instruction on an assumption I never once questioned, because it had never once failed me before you. You could have questioned it earlier," I said, not unkindly, but honestly. "Some part of you must have known it was wrong, even before I proved it." He was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes distant. "Perhaps I did. It is easier to hold an assumption than to test it, when testing it means admitting you may have caused harm you cannot undo." He straightened slightly. "For what it is worth, I intend to submit a full account of the prior incidents to Drenai Command myself, rather than waiting for the review this panel has ordered. Cyrell and the others deserve that much, even if it comes years too late to spare them what they endured." I studied him for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in his voice, and found I believed him. "That's a good place to start," I said. He nodded once, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, though it didn't quite arrive. "I do not expect forgiveness, Cadet Whitfield. I only hope, in time, that this coalition builds something better from what happened between us than what existed before it." He turned and left the chamber without another word, and I watched him go, feeling the strange, complicated weight of the moment settle over me. I hadn't wanted an apology when I walked into that training ring 5 days ago. I hadn't wanted any of this, but standing there, watching him leave, I understood that something real had shifted, not just for me, but for every human who would walk into a coalition training ring after me. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected. Coalition academies across a dozen systems began quietly revising their human training protocols, adjusting equipment specifications, retraining instructors on updated physiological data. Cyrell's account, once made public as part of the case record, prompted 2 other cadets from different training cycles to come forward with similar experiences, and Drenai Command opened what Fenwick described as the largest internal review of instructional conduct in a generation. Owen's shoulder healed. Ellie stopped flinching every time a Drenai officer raised a hand for any reason. Daniel, who had stood beside me in that training ring and refused to stay silent when it mattered most, was offered an early advancement track that he accepted with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown from the beginning. And me, I went back to training, in a ring with properly calibrated gravity plating, under a new instructor who treated our squad with a caution that sometimes bordered on nervousness, as though she wasn't entirely sure what any of us might be capable of if pushed too far. I found I didn't mind that nervousness nearly as much as I minded the old certainty it replaced. One evening, several weeks after the hearing had closed, I stood at the observation deck near the Academy's residential ring, watching the slow turn of stars beyond the station's hull, and thought about my father, about the back porch, about the lesson he'd given me long before I understood why I would ever need it. Being underestimated wasn't a weakness, he'd told me, if you knew how to use it. I hadn't understood, at 12 years old, what kind of moment might someday prove him right. I understood it now, standing on a space station 300 light-years from that porch, having cracked an assumption the entire galaxy had carried since the day humanity first said hello to the stars. I hadn't needed to be the strongest person in that training ring. I had only needed to be fast enough and honest enough to be believed. And in the end, that had been enough to change something far larger than myself. Somewhere out among those slow-turning stars, other species were reading the record of what happened here, revising their assumptions, rewriting their doctrines, learning to look twice before deciding what any of us, human or otherwise, were truly capable of. It wasn't the ending I had imagined when I first stepped into that training ring to raise a simple safety concern, but it was, I decided, watching the stars turn silently beyond the glass, exactly the ending worth having.